If I could redo the manifesto, I know one of the statements on there was nothing about us without us. There's been a recent edit to it that says nothing without us, right? Just acknowledging that we exist and belong everywhere.
Welcome to The Wheelchair Activist, a podcast hosted by me, Emma and every month I interview amazing members and allies of the disabled community who are quite literally changing the world. Tiffany, a huge welcome to the Wheelchair Activist. I'm so glad that we are able to have this conversation, and I was wondering if you could introduce yourself to our amazing listeners.
Of course. Hi, everyone. This is Tiffany Yu. I am a disability advocate based here in Los Angeles, and I recently wrote a book called The Anti-Ableist Manifesto, which launched in the US last fall and in the UK in March.
Already from the title, I was immediately interested in reading this book because it feels like there have been so many moments throughout disability rights history that this book has been needed, but particularly now when people are starting to have different conversations. And I think a lot of people are still very unaware of what ableism is and how disabled people deal with it every day. So I think let's start there. How would you define what ableism is?
I also want to highlight that the first time that the word ableism was used was 1981. And depending on who you are, that is a long time or a little time, but to me, that's pretty recent. So even though disability discrimination or prejudice or bias has existed forever, we didn't really have language for it until the 1980s. So my definition of ableism is that it is a system of oppression that devalues someone based on the way their body and or mind works. So the devaluing of someone, and I use based on the way their body and or mind works. You could replace that with disability, but part of why I use the language that I did, which is your body and or mind is different, also highlights the way that ableism as a system of oppression intersects with other systems of oppression. So sexism, or the way that the media dissects women's bodies or thinks that bodies have to look a certain way, is ableism and sexism at play. Or the way that here in the US, we have devalued, and probably in other places in the world, we've devalued people based on their race or their skin color. Again, bodies that look a little different, the devaluing of it. So anti-ableism then is what actions and strategies and policies can we put in place that equitably value someone regardless of the way their body and or mind works.
I mean, there's so much in that I would love to get into, but I was really struck by, like you said, it wasn't until the 80s that this term was a thing, and disabled people have been around since the dawn of time. And, in previous episodes I've done, I'm thinking about the one where we had a discussion about period dramas. We talked about how in those time periods, like the Regency time period, etc., there probably were more disabled people than there are now because of different living conditions, lifestyles, advances in medicine, medical technologies, all of that. So it's so striking that something so very basic and fundamental to a disabled person now, in terms of our understanding of ableism, just wasn't articulated before the 1980s. And I'm really interested in so much, like I said, but I suppose first, why did you feel that this book needed to be written, and why now?
In a lot of ways, I feel like we are on the cusp of a cultural shift around disability.
Mm.
I look at my parents' generation and even so for your listeners who may not be aware, I acquired my disability at the age of 9 in a car accident where my dad was driving. He unfortunately passed away, and I permanently paralyzed one of my arms and much later was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. And I share that because I was 9 almost 30 years ago. And 30 years ago, there didn't seem to be the social systems in place or the resources or the community to find support, or at least my mom at the time didn't know. Versus now with the internet and Facebook groups and social media and people being able to find each other online through hashtags, I think we're able to find each other a lot quicker. So, to go back to your question around why this book, why now, part of why I mentioned that I feel like we're on the cusp of this cultural shift is that this conversation has always been around. It just hasn't felt as loud as it is now because we have the power of community behind us. And part of why now is 2025 marks milestone years both in the UK and the US for disability legislation. In the UK, there's the Equality Act 2010. In the US, you have the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. And I think that for a long time, we have always looked at policy change and legislation as the gold standard for what is going to lead systemic change. But these laws are turning 15 and 35, and yet here in the US, our unemployment rates are still twice that of our non-disabled peers. So that got me thinking, why does this gap still exist if we have policy and legislation in place to protect our rights? And I think the missing piece to systemic change is that it's not just policy, it's the attitudinal shift and hearts and minds that needs to change as well. So my book is an attempt to kind of close that gap and say, okay, let me take you through a transformative framework called Me, We, Us to say, here's what you need to know about disability, ableism, anti-ableism. Here's what we need to know in relationship with each other, recognizing and interrupting microaggressions, understanding what some really common ones are that happen within the disability community. That's the we part of me, we, us. And then the us part is the more societal change. What types of policies can we put in place? And oftentimes we jump direct to the policies, saying, okay, let's start with the policies. And then we say, okay, we passed all the policies. Everything is great now. But then you look at the data and there's still bias happening. We're still not getting hired. We're still seeing inspirational tropes and kids,
Mm.
disabled kids without their consent or even any identity factors around them being used as inspiration. I could go on and on.
Yeah, I completely get what you mean, and I really want to go into your framework, but I think it's important that we give a little bit of context because I'm a policy nerd. I work in policy. I've worked in disability policy for a decade or more, and I think it's really important that people understand what we mean by that. And part of that is like what you said through legislation, but then there are also things like I'm using a really topical example because it's being taken away, but companies having diversity, equality, and inclusion strategies, or having, goals to have X number of disabled employees, or there's so many things in terms of what covers policy. And it's essentially the rules and the systems that are in place in terms of our daily lives. And those are almost more impactful, I think, than the legislation bits themselves, because it's the interpretation of that legislation into, okay, I'm a company, for example, and I know that legally I am not allowed to discriminate. So what things am I going to put in place that allow for that to A, not happen, and B, to be the type of employer that they want to be? And so I think I just wanted to just sort of clarify for people, what do we mean when we're talking about policy? And I think that that's really important. I'm wondering if you can, in terms of, like you said, there's a disconnect between these policies and that these policies say this cannot happen or this needs to happen in this way. But then, as you've said, and as I think every disabled person listening to this, and hopefully non disabled people as well, know that those instances of discrimination in terms of the legal sense. And like you said, the little instances of microaggressions or discriminatory behavior, language, etc., they're still happening. And it's incredibly frustrating, I think, as a policy expert, if I can call myself that, is that, you tell people, yeah, I, for example, work in transport, and there's a policy that transport providers must do X. But when I go to regulators and say, okay, that's great, but this is still happening, it's so difficult to get people, I don't want to say to believe that, because like you say, sometimes there is data that shows that it is happening, but I'd love for you to speak a little bit more about where the attitudinal piece comes into that.
I feel like my answer to all questions is going to be ableism. But essentially what we're seeing happen is the policies aren't getting enforced or they fall flat because the person who has the power to implement it, again, doesn't believe that we are valuable and worthy as disabled people. And I think this is part of increasing the visibility and respect of our community. I even look to some of the things that happened during the rise of anti-Asian racism in the US in 2020 with some misinformation around COVID and more overt examples of harassment and assault happening toward people who were Asian. And part of it was we weren't getting the media coverage for people to believe that this was happening. And so you started to see, unfortunately, pretty, for those of us who identify as Asian, traumatizing videos of these assaults. And I had a lot of friends kind of like send them to me, and I had to set a boundary to say, hey, this is re traumatizing for me. But I also understand that there are people who need to see this because they don't believe that this is happening, that anti-Asian racism exists.
Mm,
So I relate this back over to the disability community to say that part of how I think ableism and these policies and the attitudinal shift hasn't really happened on a broader, larger scale as I'd like to date is because of our invisibility, not because we want to be, but because people have excluded us or deemed our stories not media worthy. And if they do cover it through media, it's through harmful extreme tropes where we are either subjects of pity or superheroes. And I actually think that part of how ableism gets its power is by keeping us intentionally or unintentionally isolated and excluded so that we don't think we have any power, right? So we talked a little bit about the, policy at all levels, and there is an opportunity to take legal action if you feel like you've been discriminated against. And I even heard this, hate crimes from a race perspective are very hard to prove. I would imagine disability discrimination sometimes difficult as well. So then there's even that barrier too, where it's like, even for me to assert my rights is through legislation, or even for me to uphold these laws that are in place, I have to take legal action. And then we get looked at as a community as a liability and further dehumanized in some ways.
yeah, I think going back to what you said around the pandemic, I absolutely, recognized at the time that Asian Americans and honestly Asian people within every country, there was a lot of hate crime and a lot of disgusting things happening in the UK as well. But what also struck me while you were talking was during the pandemic in the UK, there was a news story about how the government were putting do not resuscitate orders on disabled people without their knowledge or consent. And this was particularly the individuals with learning disabilities, but those were being put in place against people's wishes, their families' wishes, whatever it might be. And that was a policy. right? That was a decision that was made. I would cite that to so many people, and they would say similar things to what you were saying. Like, where is the reporting on this? Where is the visibility that this is happening? And I think what we're ultimately talking about is how can we get people to care about disability, and how do we get people to care about the lives of a community that they don't feel that they identify with. And I think that is an unfortunate point that those of us in policy need to make by trying to create the reasons, however logical and apparent they might be, for why people should care about groups that they don't belong in. But I was wondering if you had any sort of reflections on that.
I do have a chapter in the book called Why You Should Care About Disability. I think it's chapter 8. Chapter 8 or chapter 10. The chapters may have moved around. But I spend a lot of time thinking about that question. And at a baseline level, I feel sad that I have to spend energy convincing people to care about me. In the same breath, though, I also understand, and I mentioned this in the book, that if we are to live the full, beautiful extent of our lives, we will all experience disability in one way or another. And part of perhaps what is underlying the not caring is maybe a fear, not of becoming disabled, because we will all, again, could be an accident, could be born with it, could be later in life. I wonder if what we fear is living in a world as a disabled person that isn't accessible.
Yeah,
And I also think about how if you are someone who enjoys listening to audiobooks or uses an electric toothbrush, or if you travel, your luggage has wheels on it. I mean, I could go on and on for all of the different, a jacuzzi. Um, there are so many everyday items that many of us enjoy that were initially designed for, by, and with the disability community in mind that are now just access features that we enjoy. Like even if you put your phone on silent and it vibrates, you have access to haptics, or the touch screen. And so I will also tell people that if you are enjoying your access features, I hope you can join us in the fight to advocate alongside our community as well. And I know this isn't a full complete answer as well, but at the end of the chapter or somewhere in the chapter, I talk about how there was this quote from Michelle Mi-jung Kim, who does a lot of work around racial equity. And she would often get asked the question, how do I get people to care who don't care? And her response was, I refuse to spend an inordinate amount of energy trying to convince people to care. And I would much rather spend my energy with imperfect allies who are willing to fumble and learn out loud because we're all going to make mistakes. And it's made me realize that with the title of this book, with who I am and the identities I have, this book is going to resonate with the type of person. I have access to that type of person. They also have access to networks and rooms that I may never be in. And so, as a result of them hopefully getting a copy of this book and engaging with the content, they can bring that into spaces that I'm not in. But again, I guess for me, it's how can I focus in wherever my spheres of influence are and really try to get those people on board alongside me, and also understand that I'm not going to jump directly from a first degree to a third degree. And yeah, I don't want to try to convince someone to care
mm,
about another person. Uh, and maybe that shuts me out from a large group of people, but I also know that I hope that we can continue to build allies in spaces that you and I may never be in by who gets access to this work.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, first of all, I couldn't recommend your book more. Like, I found it so incredibly fascinating so far in terms of what is in it, and I do want to come back to elements of it, particularly the use of the word manifesto. But I think it all really resonates with, I think, every disabled person, whether they see themselves as a campaigner or not, because obviously you and I would consider ourselves activists, advocates in this area. But for a disabled person who may not want to sort of make disability advocacy a huge part of either their job or their life, whatever it might be, there's something so applicable in that because there will be little fights that you will have every single day, like whether it's the person helping you get on a train, it could be the person serving you at a restaurant or a person sitting at the register, the till at a grocery store, right? They all will have these preconceptions of what disability is. And that, of course, I'm speaking about those who have a visible impairment, right? Because obviously a huge amount of disabilities are invisible or non-apparent, as I think is the term that you use. And there is a choice that needs to be made. I always say that you do sometimes have to pick your battles, and sometimes that's really difficult. And there will be instances where you think, oh, I should have said this, or I should have stood up for myself in this way, or come back with this. And it's really hard. It's energy draining, and you do have to sometimes gatekeep a little bit in terms of what you're willing to fight for and what you're not. But I think what you said about the imperfect ally is so important because I just with work, I was having a conversation with someone yesterday who worked in a transport authority, and they were feeling really bad. Like I genuinely felt that this person was struggling because they had recently been introduced to accessibility barriers in terms of transport, and they had never considered that before. They didn't know that disabled people were experiencing these particular barriers. And they felt so bad that they didn't know that. And they really wanted to now start their journey of learning and then putting that learning into action within the remit of their job. And I really wanted to reassure that person, as you said, they're the people that I'm going to potentially get on my side. I'm not going to get the, angry person who feels unwilling to budge. And that's where I'm going to put my energy is into that person who is willing. So I think it's incredibly impactful where you put your energy. And I wanted to come back. I mean, as I said, there's so much in your book, but I'm particularly interested in the way that this book feels very much like a call to arms and very much like a practical piece of advice. But I'm really interested in the choice of the word manifesto because there are some, very iconic manifestos, and it's such a powerful political word. I'm wondering if you are able to speak on how the title relates to all of the content in the book as well.
Yes. So this is actually introduced at the end of the book. And I'm holding up, if there is a video form of this, I'm holding up the Anti-Ableist Manifesto art. And essentially, it is a poster or a piece of art or a design graphic with about 30 statements on it. And the statements range from things like disability is not a bad word or a bad thing, be curious but respect boundaries, diversify your feed, accommodations and accessibility promote equity. And a manifesto, so there are many parts of this title and even the cover that make people feel something. And the point of my work has always been I want it to be a catalyst for conversation. I want it to encourage more conversation, more curiosity, gently in a way that brings you in. And so, this manifesto art introduced at the end of the book, all of the statements on here actually correspond with chapters in the book. So, I believe some early chapters are about the definition of the word disability and inclusive language around removing negative value judgments around disability or disability related terms. There's a chapter on history that would align with the donor race history. So, as I was writing the book, I actually thought of each chapter in the context of what that chapter might look like on a manifesto. And when I think about a manifesto, it's guiding principles or guidance, or like you said, a call to arms of what living in an anti-ableist world could potentially look like. I couldn't include everything, but that is where the origins of the manifesto came from. So even as I was originally starting to write the book, I actually started out with what are some manifesto-like phrases that we continue to repeat in the disability community. Not all disabilities are apparent. Disability is not a bad word is always like the first one. It's people's introduction into the space. Don't erase history. So I started writing those and then figured out, okay, how can we make them descriptive enough so that they could become chapter titles? So you'll notice there's a little bit of a difference between the chapter title and what ends up appearing on the manifesto.
I just thought I want that artwork in like a huge size on my wall because there were so many empowering phrases on there. I particularly noticed one that is used in the UK a huge amount, which is nothing about us without us. And it's again, it's something I really try and drive home in all elements of my work, but I think all of those statements are so incredibly important and they're very clear and they're very to the point and they're very emotive. And I think that that's incredibly important. I'm wondering throughout the process of writing the book, I am thinking about conversations that I've had with my line manager. So shout out Caroline, if you're listening to this. When we, approach funders or we talk to decision makers and they say to us, okay, well, what would you ultimately like to see in terms of the work that you're doing? What's the goal? And she always says that, well, the best outcome is that our organization doesn't need to exist anymore because everything is accessible. Disabled people have equal access to transport and street space. And I think that's so hard for people to comprehend, a world where these things don't happen and where organizations like Transport for All or other amazing charities don't need to exist. But I'm wondering if you wanted to speak a little bit about how an inclusive world would really look and how it could feel and how it could benefit people.
I think about, so you could call it a disability inclusive world. I also like using the phrase an accessibility first culture or an accessibility first world. And what that essentially means for me is that no matter how your body or mind works, you can show up in a space and not experience friction for how you are going to engage in that space. And I've kind of been reflecting. So I'm someone who has an upper extremity disability. And I share this example in the book of a bunch of my friends going to a pottery class. And I asked my friend if they knew if the pottery studio could accommodate someone who could only use one arm. I think they were using those, I'm sure there's a formal term for the little spinny things where you
The
put your,
wheel.
the wheel,
Yes.
spinny thing, wheel. And my friends didn't know. So I reached out to the pottery studio and didn't hear anything. And so, in a desire to not make things uncomfortable, I opted out. And I think about the ways that we as disabled people opt out because we don't know if our access needs are going to be met if we show up. That's a small everyday example, but it also meant I'm not deepening my connection with my friends. It's still on my bucket list to find a studio who is responsive to know that I'm coming. And I've also had examples where I've gone to a conference where they have a biking activity in the morning. I have given the organizers a heads up that I'm coming. I require the left handle brake to be connected to the back wheel and the seat to be low enough for my height so that my feet can reach the ground. And I remember showing up to that morning biking activity and being like, "Hi, I'm Tiffany." And they go, "Oh, your bike is ready for you." And
Okay.
I think about the difference in those two experiences. And again, I wanted to highlight those because I also just want to highlight the diversity of disability. And there are things that I'm sure you navigate, Emma, as a wheelchair user, and things I navigate as someone who can only use one arm. Like one thing that I still have not figured out is how to throw my trash into those heavy dumpsters with the heavy covers. Uh,
Ooh, okay. If anyone knows how to do that or has any
with
gadgets,
one
please,
hand.
yeah, please put them in the comments and we will make sure that Tiffany sees it.
And so even if I go at a baseline level, I just want to take out my trash. And sometimes when I'm giving talks, I'll talk about wanting to cut my steak. And I want to bring those up because I think we go to work. We think about like, okay, how do I get a job as a disabled person? Or how do we get transport to be accessible? When sometimes for many of us with disabilities, not sometimes, probably always, we are navigating micro decisions every single day about everything. Like, am I going to buy this onion from the grocery store because do I have the right cutting board and knife in place to cut it with one hand without the onion rolling everywhere, which has happened before. um, but that's more of a long-winded way of just saying I want to remove the friction. There is a term that was coined by Mia Mingus called access intimacy. And my version of how I'm interpreting access intimacy is, again, being able to show up at a place and not have to ask for permission to show up. One example I do include in the book is going to a concert. And this is a newer event venue that was built in LA, in Los Angeles. And in every single area of the stadium, they had a section for accessible seating with unobstructed views. So if everyone was standing, if you were seated, you would still be able to view it, and space for your friends, right?
Wow.
Like oftentimes, or for a lot of these older buildings, it's one designated accessible area and only one seat for a disabled person, assuming that we don't have friends or that we're not going to this place with our friends. And if you want to go by yourself, that's totally fine too. But again,
Yeah.
it's like people making the assumptions for us without taking our perspectives or keeping in mind that we will want to access these spaces as well.
I mean, my God, if that type of venue existed in the UK, I think I would be there every week. I mean, it's so spooky almost that you mentioned like those different examples, but I think you say that they're small, but they're really not because they are everyday life. And I think you're absolutely right. There's this assumption that disabled people don't do those things, right? That we don't go to pottery classes, we don't go to concerts, we go to medical appointments. If we're lucky, we go to work. And, we talked about the disability employment gap, which is also in the UK. But you're right, in sort of more just everyday spaces, there are so many barriers. Just this past week, I was looking at going to a play in London and I was trying to get accessibility information for this venue. I haven't been there before and it was really difficult to find the information. And one of the people who I was going with said, well, let's buy the disabled ticket, for the wheelchair user and the carer, and, just sort of see when we get there. And that felt so uncomfortable for me because my thought was, well, what if the visibility is terrible from that seat? What if we purchase the ticket, we then use money that, is not in ample supply for any of us right now, and to sort of roll the dice on if that is or isn't going to be a good experience. And just as you were talking, I was thinking, how wrong is it that I would feel embarrassed or uncomfortable in that situation? Say I get there and then it turns out that there's terrible visibility. It's the venue that should be embarrassed for not being accessible. But I don't know, just as you were talking, I was just really thinking, and I don't know if that resonates with you, that sort of feeling that I'm the problem, I should go. Or like you say, I'm going to exclude myself because I don't want to make a scene. And for people who know me, they're probably really laughing because I'm one of the most dramatic people you've ever met. And making a scene can be very fun. But it's so strange how this feeling of almost shame kind of comes on the disabled person for being the one to need the adjustments. I don't know, does that resonate with you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of the unlearning, right? We are unlearning feeling like a burden for existing. And, in that pottery example, that was me. Like, I'm still working on my own, unlearning my own internalized ableism of, oh, I don't want to make this uncomfortable for everyone else. But I think this is the delicate balance that we play between making the change or being exhausted and focusing on our own sustainability. So, what I mean by that is by me showing up at the pottery class or you showing up at the play, we are forcing these places to confront that they haven't thought about us. And if I could redo the manifesto, I know one of the statements on there was nothing about us without us. There's been a recent edit to it that says nothing without us, right? Because maybe the concert venue wasn't initially about us, but essentially now we're trying to go and it's not accessible for us. So it's also just acknowledging that we exist and belong everywhere. And if we choose to, again, I would acknowledge a nuance that just because we're disabled, we're not courageous or brave. But if we are feeling like having our advocacy hat on to be courageous and sit in the discomfort that everyone else has made us feel for our whole lives, force people to feel that friction, I think they will change. And I remember I had the opportunity to be part of a selection committee for this award. You don't need to know the context of it, but one of the finalists was deaf. And one of the things I brought up is that if and when we select this person as a winner, it will change how we view access for the events that we host and how we bring the whole group together. Because now we're incorporating ways that they can communicate and engage with the group if they use sign language interpreters or if they require captioning. And as a result, then maybe you'll start to see more deaf people apply for the award, right? And so I think back to this conversation of visibility. I also combine it with possibility, lots of ability, ability words, because when I started my career in investment banking, I did so many informational interviews with disabled students who literally had never thought that a career in financial services or at a bank could be for them because they had never seen someone who had an apparent disability. And now there are a lot more, and I'm feeling really excited that when we talk about disability representation, it's more than just on the policy side or in Hollywood, where I live. We're also seeing that representation in tech, in marketing agencies, in the banks. And so, again, I come back to nothing without us because we're existing everywhere.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, what you put in your book and what I cite all the time is just how many disabled people there really are. So if you're designing or creating a digital space, a physical space, whatever it might be, then there's only going to be a benefit to doing it in an inclusive way. But I think, you're absolutely right about the representation point. And honestly, that's why I started this podcast was because I knew disabled people who weren't just campaigners. I say just like that's a bad thing because I admire disability campaigners immensely, but for people who are disabled who don't want to make it their job or their career, which, why should you have to? Like no other characteristic about you means that you need to work in a particular area. And I wanted disabled people to have that representation because if you don't see yourself there, then the fear, the anxiety, and all of that that comes with, well, I'm going to be the first person to, in your case, maybe the first person in this investment banking system or, in this company. And that can feel really daunting and really scary because we are also human. We get things wrong, and what might work for us could be completely unsuitable to the next disabled person that applies. But I think being there and having that visibility is so incredibly important because that's the only way that people are going to enter all the different spheres of life and work because someone has to be first. And it's daunting though.
Oh no, for sure. And there's a book I read by Shonda Rhimes. It was called The Year of Yes. And I believe this quote is from the book, but she talks about the FOD. FOD stands for first only different. And I'm going to paraphrase the quote, but she says, every FOD has the same weary look in their eyes. And in passing, you will all know each other because that weary look represents the ability or the fact that we can't fail. We don't have the space to be the full wholeness of being human because if we
Mm.
fail, then potentially we limit opportunity for everyone else who could come after us. Um, but then I think about that other quote that was like, but what if you succeed? Or like, what if you fly? And so at the same time, I also think about how many more opportunities have been created because I can pinpoint, I didn't get to include this story in the book because my editor didn't think it was as impactful. But every single year after my investment banking year, I knew at least one investment banking analyst who was coming in who had a diagnosed disability. And I can't say if I was the first one, but I guess I just felt not only were we building like our small community of disabled investment bankers, but it and I don't know if it was me paving the way, but at least to be able to start to see, okay, maybe this year it's one, maybe next year it's another one, but maybe now it's two, maybe now it's five. And exactly like you said, I think with this expanded definition of disability that includes chronic illnesses, mental health conditions, neurodivergent disabilities, like many of us are realizing that we are disabled, even if we may not identify as such. And I leave that to an individual to self-identify. But yeah, I think about how lonely it is to be that FOD. In some ways, I wonder if we as a society are obsessed with firsts. I can even look at my own journey in university and in my professional realm where I can say that I was the first to do these things. But I don't want to be the I don't and
Yeah,
I want to make it more okay to be the fifth. Uh
yeah,
because you're continuing on paving that way. So maybe like when one like I'm just thinking of the imagery of like one person paving the way and it's just a thin line and then you have two and the road becomes wider so that other people have access to that opportunity.
yeah. I think what you were saying about being that first, or honestly, I think it goes much wider than that, but this pressure that disabled people feel to be exceptional or to be amazing at the job, to just be considered worthy of the opportunity that you were given. And it's such a toxic attitude, but I so understand. And I do this as well. I feel like I need to be the best head of policy that there ever was because my employer decided to hire me when, in theory, they could have hired a non disabled person. There's no guarantee that that non disabled person is going to be better than me. And there's no guarantee that they're going to require less of the company than I am. But I think, disabled people feel this pressure to be amazing because someone took a chance. in theory, this idea of, oh, they could have gone with the safer option. And I think that's not only incorrect, but it's really harmful because, like you said, we don't get to be human. And I'm sure I've said this on the podcast before, but if I haven't, it even goes into this was a couple of years ago, but I was having a conversation with my therapist and I was talking about this sort of feeling of how I have to be amazing. I have to give 110% and all of these ridiculous things. And she said, well, Emma, you're only human. And I sort of scoffed and went, well, yeah, technically. But, just that we can't be fully human because if we're the only disabled person that someone interacts with, we're, for lack of a better expression, like the poster child for that person in terms of how they view disability. And that feels really heavy. And it's not how it should be at all because we are as diverse as any other group that you want to pick, and in terms of different aspects of our identity that we have, or even in our disabilities. I started my job at a charity, and my team was three women who all had the exact same condition as me. It was very odd. We all had the exact same type of spinal muscular atrophy, but our needs were so different. Our, typing ability was different. Our, everything was so different. And I think it would be really easy for people to think that everyone with this type of impairment needs this. And that's just not the case. But I want to come back to the book and I want to talk about who is your target audience for this? Because we've talked about how this book is a major catalyst for people to start to have these conversations or even these internal like conversations about their internalized ableism, and then they can use that, like you've said, in the spaces that they occupy. But when you were writing it, who was it for?
Such a good question. I do want to touch on something you were saying earlier about this, perhaps the burden of exceptionality or being amazing and feeling like we should be extraordinary. And something I think about is I think about the things I'm amazingly ordinary at and how extraordinarily ordinary I am. I suck at bowling. And there was a sound on Instagram that was going viral, and it's like, it's okay to have hobbies that you're bad at. And I don't know if it comes with time or age or confidence in my own capabilities as a disabled person, but I do find myself relieving and forgiving and being compassionate about not having a hot take on everything all the time. There is so much that is going on in the administration in the US right now. I can barely keep up. But what I know how to do, and I see all my friends putting together these really amazing Instagram educational carousels, and I just hit that share button. I was like, I don't have energy to open up Canva and design something nice.
Yeah.
And and this is where I lean into community. But to your question about who I wrote this book for, I actually wrote this book as a disabled person toward a non-disabled reader. And one of my early reviews of the book said, this book feels like a must-read for humanity type of book. There are things that if I had written the book toward a disabled reader, I would have included that I couldn't. I would have talked way more about finding community, exploring what disabled pride and joy look like for you. But I will highlight there's another book that came out recently by Julie Harris called Boldly Belong, which is geared towards the disability community. And she has a little framework in there. And if you are someone who is deeply entrenched in disability studies, the academic study of disability, or even maybe someone like you, Emma, maybe this book is too much of a primer level. And that was something that I had to grapple with as I was writing this book. But I got really clear on who my audience is and who even before this book came out, I knew I was already potentially reaching with my background at these different companies so far. All of that to say, though, the biggest support of this book, now in the US, it's on its third printing, of this book getting the attention and the visibility that it has had, has been thanks to the disability community. And I actually got a note earlier this week from someone who is disabled who said, my therapist and I want to thank you. We're going through the book. Every single chapter closes with reflection questions. If you are someone who may be newer on your disability pride journey, maybe some of those reflection questions help you uncover where you may be devaluing yourself. Again, having your own internalized ableism. But that was my thought. And my other thought was, I know in some ways, I would love to see if there's a way I can be a bridge between the advocacy world and these more corporate-y spaces. And in the introduction of the book, I talk about how I never want learning to be about shame. And I think that part of how we may have gotten some people to care about disability was through shame. If shame slash guilt became the initial motivating factor to show up, I'm glad you're here, but that feeling won't sustain you to continue showing up for us. So I acknowledge that wherever your starting point is in this space is wherever it is. And hopefully we can guide you along to make a little bit of progress or learn something new as you work through the book.
What emotion or what motivation, other than shame or guilt, do you hope people are coming from or that you've seen people have come from?
Yeah, again, coming back to the early reviews, one of the reviews said it left her feeling energized that a disability inclusive society is possible. So I do have a chapter in the book where I talk about guilt and shame and how there is guilt and shame that leads to inaction, saying, oh, well, I didn't know, like, I'm just trying to do my best. That wasn't my intention. And then you opt out. You have the privilege to opt out. Or there is guilt and shame that leads you to action. And how can we find that fine line between you acknowledging that we're all unlearning ableism and we all have bias that we are constantly unlearning, even as disabled people as well, um, and do that together in community with each other. But yeah, I think the feeling is hope and possibility because I think about my journey of being disabled for almost 30 years. And I spent the first half of that kind of sitting in shame and silence and negative self-image. And I look at the second half of that period of time of exploring what disability pride means to me, what it means to be proud to be disabled, what does disabled joy look like, entrenching myself in disability community. And part of what keeps me going in this work for this long, and there are people who have spent their whole entire lifetimes in here, part of it is that I want people to see disabled people the way I do, as a magic generative force where we see community care and mutual aid. We show up for each other, we amplify each other, even in the process of this book, of writing it, of it coming out. All of the stories from community, from people in the community that I've gotten to meet and help amplify their work and their story. Like, I'm just so grateful to be a part of this community. And yeah, I want other people to see us like how we see us.
I think that's absolutely fantastic. And before we wrap up, and I say a massive thank you, I want you to tell people where they could find the book and then particularly what ways can they access the book that are, I'm just going to say, are the most beneficial for you because we know that there are corporate overlords who will benefit by what would be the best way for you.
You know, I've gotten that question a lot. And as someone who did work with a bigger publisher, I don't think I reap the benefits per se as much depending on where you get it from. But you are able to get the book in print, paperback in the UK, hardcover in the US. audio and ebook. So depending on which format benefits you best, I would say get it from your favorite retailer. And if the big billionaire company is the place where you get your books, and that's accessible and easy for you, and sometimes that's the most budget friendly as well, do that. If you want to support some amazing indie bookstores, there are some really great disability owned ones that I have found in the US. The Last Bookstore in LA is one that I personally support. I am coming out to London, and Common Press Bookshop and Scarlet Letters are two that I have found, two indie bookshops I found that we may or may not be hosting some book events at too. So if you happen to be in the UK, you can see if we might be doing any events there. And the place to find all the links, if you don't have a favorite retailer, is you can go to tiffanyyu.com/book and it'll have all the information there.
Amazing. And we will make sure that we link your website and some of the retailers for US and UK in the description for this episode. But Tiffany, I want to say a massive thank you for joining me and having this really important conversation about your incredibly important book. It's been incredibly insightful. So thank you so, so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of The Wheelchair Activist. If you want to stay up to date and catch all of our previous episodes, you can find them all on my website, thewheelchairactivist.com. You can also follow me on social media at emma.vogelman on most platforms. And if you'd like to support the podcast, our links to the GoFundMe and Buy Me a Coffee are in this episode description. And I'm so excited to bring you another episode next month. See you then.